little after 7. Scott, do you want to kick things off and get us started?
Yeah, thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. We have a lot to cover, so I think we'll jump right in. It's great to see so many of you tonight, and I'm sure there'll be some other folks trickling in the next few minutes. So thanks everyone for being here. My name is Scott Olsher. I'm a transportation planner for Clackamas County in the Department of Transportation and Development. And with me tonight is Stacy Goldstein from the Department of Transportation and Development, as well as our consulting team from MIG, John Finas and Alex Dupai. So the reason we're here tonight is we want to go over draft recommendations for the Rhododendron Main Street project. It's a project we started just before the pandemic hit, and we've been plugging away for a little bit over a year now on this project, and have had some great input in the last year. And thanks everybody for that went to the survey that we had open a few weeks ago, and thanks everyone for completing that survey. So this is a project that builds on a couple of previous efforts, the Rhody Rising Visioning Plan and the Mount Hood Ped Bike Implementation Plan. It is a targeted site-specific project that builds on those two previous efforts. So tonight we really want to focus on the development sites and the associated frontage improvements associated with the redevelopment sites. I'm happy to talk to people at another time about if there's opportunities for a wider project looking at the wider Rhody community. But tonight, this project is really targeted to the two sites that we'll look at, and want to get your comments and your feedback on the draft plans that we've put together. So the way this will work is we'll have a PowerPoint that we'll share with you that has the draft recommendations and a little bit of background information. So we'll go through this, touch on some next steps for this project, and then have time for comment, input, and question and answers. So with so many tonight, as John mentioned, please we'll keep everybody muted so we can get through the presentation, and then we should have plenty of time for question and answers. And feel free to use the chat function. I think most folks are familiar with some of the Zoom functions. You can put in questions via the chat. And I think that's all I have. I did want to pass it over to Steve briefly to welcome everybody and say hi. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you for a minute.
Well, I just have to say to John and the people at MIG and to Scott and all of the folks at Clackamas County, thank you for all of the hard work that you guys have been putting into this. The Rhododendron CPO has kind of taken a back seat to all of this because this has been a Clackamas County MIG project that was initiated by the Rhododendron CPO. But then we kind of turn it over to Clackamas County, and they're taking the ball and running with it. And tonight we'll see some of the results of the efforts over the past year that have been put together with everybody's input, or as many people as we could get based on the COVID restrictions that we've had. It's unfortunate that we couldn't have some in-face meetings, face-to-face meetings, in-person meetings during this whole project, but we'll get by, and hopefully as we're coming down the other side of this mountain, the COVID mountain that we have, we might be able to have one face-to-face meeting, because I think we have one or two more meetings scheduled on the plan. So let's see what happens, and thank you everybody for attending, and I look forward to a nice productive meeting.
All right, thanks Steve. So we do have a lot to cover, and like I said, I want to hear from everybody and have time for people to comment and let us know what you think. So we're going to jump right in, and I'll turn it over to John Venus, who will lead us through the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for spending the time with us tonight. We really appreciate you being here. As Steve and Scott mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work, and we're really excited to share what we've been doing and some of the draft recommendations. Everything tonight, I want you to keep in mind, these are all draft materials, so this is the first time we've been able to present what the recommendations are, and so this is an opportunity to explain what those are and hear from you about what you think about those, what changes we might need to see, and so forth. A couple housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded, so we will have this as a recorded meeting. We'll post the video and all the chat comments onto the Clackamas County website, where you can find all sorts of good materials from this project that we've developed so far. And I'll tell you more about where you can find that and what the next steps will be in this process closer towards the end of the presentation. With me tonight is Alex Dupe, also with MIG. He'll be keeping an eye on the chat feature. This is a great way to send us your questions, comments, keep those going as we walk through the presentation. That would be really helpful. Just to get through all the information we have, I would appreciate it if you hold questions until the end of the presentation. We'll have plenty of time for that. So that would be a big help. So please use the chat feature, and we will get to questions and address some of those chats closer towards the end of the presentation.
Yeah, just say as things come up when John's presenting, just put them in the chat. I'm keeping track of that, and then we can come back to that as we step through in the Q&A.
Thanks, Alex. So tonight, the presentation really features these 5 topics. So we're going to start off with a little background. Scott provided a little insight, as well as Steve. So we'll talk about where this project came from, why we are working on this project. Then we'll talk about the process, how we move from step to step to identify the findings that we found, as well as the recommendations. Then the potential alternatives. Hopefully many of you got to weigh in on those potential alternatives over the winter. So we'll talk about those and what the results were for that. That gets us to the draft recommendations. As I mentioned, these are a first draft, and our expectation is that we'll get some good comments from tonight to improve on those and to refine those. And then I'll talk about next steps, as I mentioned. So I think it's important to start off with all of the great work that has taken place in Rhododendron by the community planning organization in developing Rhody Rising. And so this is really where this project lifts off from. We built on the Rhody Rising document and the vision. So I thought that was important to start there, because this project, I know Steve mentioned it's a MIG County project, but it's important to say that this is really the community plan. This is buy-in for the people that live and work and pass through and stop and stay in the community of Rhododendron. So we have a great vision to build off of, and that's exactly where we started with this project over a year ago. And that vision plan has a lot of really great ideas that we were able to build on. We're not starting from scratch. That's not what this was about. So it was important to go to the vision, find out what matters to the community, what are some of the things that the community would like to see. Ultimately, that translates directly into the recommendations, and we hope we can show you how that took place. The purpose of this particular project is starting off with a partnership between the Transportation and Growth Management Plan, Clackamas County, the Rhododendron Community Planning Organization, and Mount Hood Holdings, the property owner. It's really a pretty unique project to have that partnership to involve the community and what the potential of this property can be. It's a very important piece of the community, right on the highway, right in the kind of core of Rhododendron. So that's very important to keep in mind. So the purpose of this particular project, number one, support the roadie vision. That's the most important element. And then there's some other points here that are important to talk about, and really the integration between transportation and land use. And that's obviously very important here alongside the highway that runs right through Rhododendron. So thinking about transportation and land use together and how important those are to work off of one another. Encouraging transportation efficient land uses and reducing transportation system demand and accommodating workforce housing. And I'm going to talk about how all of those elements took place during the study process. So our site involves these two parcels. And if you've ever been to Mount Hood Foods or the post office or Still Creek Inn, you look across the highway and there we are. So here's Highway 26 right in the middle. We're on the west side of the highway. There's the Always Towing property. There's some parking off the highway, a hotel, and some houses, some cabins. So those are the existing uses. And as Scott mentioned, this project is really about what the future of these two parcels is. What could take place in these parcels based on what the property owner would like to see, what the community would like to see, and what's possible, what could take place. As part of this project, we're also looking at the improvements to Highway 26, and I'll show you some examples. A lot of you are familiar with what the conditions are today, but it's also looking at the frontage improvements to make a better place for people to walk and bike and take transit. So you take a closer look, and there's a lot to look at here. There are a lot of opportunities on these two parcels, but there are a lot of challenges. And perhaps one of the more important opportunities are just how many great community assets surround these two parcels. Historic cabins, the Zigzag River, the swinging bridge, the footbridge that crosses the river, the Barlow Trail historic marker and garden, transit being a very important piece to this corridor with the Mount Hood Express, and then that connectivity, across the highway, both to those transit stops and to the destinations across the highway. But there are also some challenges to this site, and the fact that we're between a river and a highway have a lot of constraints, and those have to do with some of the setbacks and basically what's remaining for that developable portion that we'll talk about in just a minute. So the site today, as I mentioned, an important transit stop, but again, you can kind of see the existing conditions. There's no designated ingress or egress. There's no curb, there's no sidewalk. There's basically a mix of gravel parking, asphalt parking, and everything in between. But right now, it's currently, you'll see a lot of folks parking here, maybe not this time of year, but in the summer when these photos were taken, including a jumping off point for transit, both for workers, for people visiting, and so on. So some amenities here, we just want to highlight the importance of these amenities and what they mean to the site. That footbridge, such an important part of Rhododendron, providing connectivity across the river, really an iconic part of Rhododendron. And then, all these uses along the highway, the cabins that are set back in the community, the commercial uses, and everything in between. So there's a really important community, and that's something that we started off with, is to really figure out what exists today. So let's talk about the process and what we did along the way. So we started about a year ago, and right at the beginning of the pandemic, we couldn't have timed it any better. But we were able to do a lot, even if it was by a Zoom call. So we had a online site tour. Several of you, I think, were part of that, to talk about what exists today, bring us up to speed on what's been going on. We did a few interviews, talked to folks that live and work in this area, figure out what their interests are. Then we had our first survey. We had a great turnout. I'll show you results of that in a second. We had a feasibility study. It's one thing to hear about what people want to see, but it was another thing to find out what's feasible, looking at a market perspective. This past fall and winter, we developed alternatives. I'll show you those and the results of those. We had an online open house in that second survey with, again, a really great turnout to hear from folks about some of the alternatives for this site. And here we are today, winter of 2021, presenting the preferred alternative and some of the recommendations around that. And this isn't the final meeting. I think, Steve, you mentioned some upcoming opportunities. I'll talk about those in just a minute. So this is, again, the first time we're presenting these. So you'll have plenty of time to review the materials that we're presenting tonight. So some results of community-wide engagement. Rhododendron is a smaller community, and I'd like to just point out the fact that the responses that we got, the people that we heard from, was really incredible. So we had over 10 folks on our online site tour back in spring of 2020. We had 3 interviews, and then in that first survey we had 116 respondents, which is fantastic. The second most recent survey we had about double that. We had 239 completed surveys to our online questionnaire. So again, the information that we collected, the ideas that we heard from, it's really built on all the folks that participated in this planning process that we heard from and built into these recommendations. So what did we hear? Well, this is a chart from that first survey. And we asked, what are some of the opportunities that you see here? What are some challenges? The top 2, I don't think it's a surprise to many of you, have to do with the impact of Highway 26. It's no surprise, it's a busy corridor, but the top 2 concerns that folks had, number 1, unsafe conditions for walking and biking. Crossing is an issue, obviously, and then related impacts, speed, noise, traffic. A third item on here is also kind of the top concerns, is the appearance and condition of buildings and businesses. So the highway is a concern and an issue, and the kind of the appearance and the look and feel of the community being another one. As part of that first survey, we also asked, what would you like to see here? What are some things that might work? Is it housing? Is it commercial uses? Is it a hotel? What are your thoughts on that? So these wheels represent results from that first survey. The darker blue represents responses that we got that said, this looks great. The lighter color was, yeah, I don't think so. And then the gray was no response. So overall, if we asked about, what do you think about housing for this site? It was a little bit of a mixture. The apartments, maybe, tiny homes, maybe, had more support for townhomes or condos. That might have something to do with sort of that Cascadian architectural style. I'm not sure, but either way, there was some support for some level of housing, even though we had kind of a mixture of what people wanted to see. We also asked about non-residential uses. There was mention of hotel in the Rhody Rising vision plan. The potential for something like a boutique hotel, maybe small commercial uses. So we asked about those. There was some support. There was, I think, majority support for a hotel, again, a smaller scale hotel, as well as a lot more support for some kind of small scale commercial or office use. So we were starting to understand, what are people wanting to see? What do you like to see happen here? So the feasibility study, this was really a great way to take the results of that first survey and find out, from a market perspective, what's really going to take place likely down the road. No one has a crystal ball, but if we look at some data from the market, from real estate, from rental results, we might be able to put that puzzle together. So I thought it was important to show this graph showing growth in tourism and visitor spending. A lot of you in this meeting probably not surprised by that graphic, but it's a popular area. People love to come to the mountain for a number of reasons. So there is that strong growth in tourism, and I think over this past year we've probably seen that more than ever before. People wanting to get out of their house and get outdoors. So growth in tourism, What does that mean for the potential for this site? We also learned that there's a stable workforce, a stable younger workforce, but not that much housing, pretty limited housing supply. Overall, when we think about housing, the feasibility study told us that when we look at the market area, there's a greater demand for rental housing, but not as much for home ownership. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The feasibility study also found that there's some potential for a hospital, and especially if you think about, what's offered in maybe Sandy versus government camp. There's not much in between. So is there potential for something like that? And then lastly, there were some positive results for some kind of small scale commercial or office space. So some good information. So when we kind of layer that information together with that first survey, it's very helpful to kind of see where are we going to go with those alternatives. So let's talk about the alternatives. Hopefully, most of you, maybe all of you, had a chance to weigh in on the alternatives this past winter. But the alternatives were a way to figure out, if we take all the information we've gathered to date, how can we present this in a way to figure out what do people like best? What is the larger community, people that are interested in rhododendron, that live and work there, what do they want to see take place? So that's really what the alternatives helped us find out. So we developed 3 alternatives, and the point of these, again, is to really not have everything the same. It's intentionally to try to make these a little different so we can compare and contrast some of those results. So the first alternative, this option was purely non-residential. So we intentionally did not show any housing. This was mainly a hotel. It's that purple shape down towards the bottom. So this is, again, the subject property, the 2 parcels. We're thinking about these 2 parcels as kind of one cohesive property. But this first alternative looked at the potential for a hotel. And this is a kind of hypothetical 2-story hotel, about 58 units. There's parking that is related to that use. And then to the north, we have reuse of an existing building, a small 1,400 square foot building. That's shown in this top right picture, showing what that could look like. This is a reuse of a gas station in Prineville, Oregon. And then adding another small scale retail building closer towards the north end of the site with a small patio to support that use. The one consistent thing with all 3 alternatives is the potential public plaza to the north end of the site. That's a county-owned property. Looking at that as a improved public space for public use. So that's consistent throughout all the alternatives. The other consistency is potentially a trail that's in that river setback area. I believe there was a similar type of an idea in the Rhodey Rising plan, but either way, this could be something that might be added within that setback area. The other thing that is consistent with these 3 alternatives is basically a required river setback. So county regulations require about a 100-foot setback from the river to the developable area. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. So alternative A was the hotel and 2 smaller scale retail spaces. So the next 2 alternatives, B and C, were primarily looking at housing. We know there's a demand for housing. We know that this is something that we wanted to try out. So the next 2 alternatives really looked at housing. So alternative B, this alternative has those same 2 commercial spaces to the north, that reuse of the gas station, and then a new retail use, small scale. Again, these are 1,400 to 1,600 square feet. The plaza, like I said, that's to the north of the site, patio deck. And then these 4 different kind of housing units that would be situated within the property. And what we wanted to test out, we know that there was interest in rental housing. We know that the feasibility study told us that there's a good chance that something like some apartments would work well here. So we tried that out with this alternative. Here's an example of a type of house that might look like. But essentially, these are walk-up cabin-style apartments. These don't have the architectural details that I know a lot of folks would be interested in. Just thinking about the use at this point, what these might, how these might work. So these would all be served by central parking with a kind of central drive aisle through the property to access these buildings. Another difference with this alternative is the alternative A and alternative B. So the first one we talked about and this one both show a potential mid-block crossing or a crossing over or across Highway 26 to connect with Little Brook Lane and Mount Hood Foods. So that's something that's unique to those first two alternatives. So the last alternative, alternative C, this one has a slight variation on that last one we just saw. And again, it's predominantly housing, but the difference here is relocating the commercial or non-residential uses closer towards the center of the property to align more with those more active uses on the other side of the highway. So the post office, the grocery store. So that's what this one would be doing. The difference here is also would be shifting that potential crossing, highway crossing, to central of that site. So to kind of align with those retail uses and the grocery store and post office across the street. As far as the housing goes, just a slight variation on where those are located. This one has housing closer to the north end of the site where we had retail before, but otherwise, we're generally spacing these out given the setbacks from the river and from the highway. So same internal street in here with two defined access points to the north and south of the site. So let's find out what we found from the online open house to see what the results were. So the first thing we did was we wanted to compare apples to apples. And so we developed what we heard from that first survey, from the interviews, the site tour, from Rhody Rising, which are essentially the values of the community, the things that people really want to see take place. And so these are the values on the left side, and this is how we measured or asked folks to respond to some of those alternatives. So how well does this alternative balance any new development with the natural environment? That's very important. How well does it integrate with surrounding small-scale development, the Steiner cabins? How well does it provide a needed mixture of housing or mixture of uses? And then lastly, is this alternative providing a adequate public area or green space? We know that's something that is also important to see. So the results are shown here on this right-hand graphic. This particular question, we said, give us your top, rank the choices, alternative A through C. What's your first choice, second choice, third choice? So alternative A, that was not very popular. Only about 7% kind of voted for that one as their first or second choice. So the majority picked that one as their third choice. This alternatives B and C, so the housing alternatives, it was really a kind of a toss-up. Not much of a difference between the two, other than the fact that had the most support. So there was definitely an overall support for housing, whether or not that's your, kind of your first or second choice. So some other things that we found out, we did have some open comment features with that survey. So, generally tell us what you think. And a lot of the comments were overall in support of housing, some type of housing. In fact, a lot of the comments actually were in favor of some sort of affordable housing, as something that could take place here. A lot of the comments also had general distaste or disapproval of any kind of a hotel or maybe housing that's out of scale with the surrounding community. Again, scale, being a big part of what community envisions to have happen here. So we regrouped as a project team with Clackamas County, with ODOT, and we talked about some of the comments that the county or the state has on the alternatives. The first one being the zoning would require a reduction in the number of housing units that we were showing. So that's the first one. The second one, accommodating a transit and access stop. And we didn't really show these in the alternatives probably the best way we could have, because we were going to develop recommendations later on in talking with ODOT and others. But that was something that we wanted to highlight here, is we need to show how that's going to take place. Considering a park and ride parking area, obviously that one of the first photos I showed, it's used that way today, you know, that unimproved parking area. So thinking about potentially improving a park and ride location for transit. Another one is dedicating those right-of-way improvements we're going to talk about here in a second. So those would be part of the public right-of-way with the highway. And then another one here is the importance of preserving existing legal access to those lots that are just north of this site. So we really have to make sure those stay preserved. So next is the frontage concept, the improvements along the highway and potential crossing across the highway. So the first set of questions we asked, you know, more about the site, the land uses in the site. The second set of questions asked, what would the highway frontage look like? What would people like to see with that? So with the frontage concepts, we provided two different concepts, concept A and B. Concept A is a separated sidewalk and bike lane. Let me give a little bit of context to this graphic if you're not familiar. This is basically a cross section of Highway 26. This would be looking west as you're heading towards Sandy. The subject property is here on the left side of the screen. And this would be a future development, this building shown here. So in this image, this concept would include a 10-foot sidewalk, and it would be separated from cyclists who would have their own 8-foot wide bike lane. And so 10-foot sidewalk, 8-foot bike lane, and then separating those two sections from the auto traffic and the highway would be a 7-foot vegetated buffer. And that's something that we heard a lot of comments about, was the need to have some sort of a buffer, you know, separating people walking and biking, taking transit from highway traffic. Both of the concepts, another consistency between the two, show a potential pedestrian refuge that would happen with a at-grade crossing. So a crossing that would go across the highway at this point with optional flashing beacons. So that's an option that is included in both of these cross sections. We'll talk about that in a second. So that's concept A. Concept B, very slightly, as I mentioned, the potential crossing and refuge is also in this concept. But as far as the frontage improvements go, this concept is different because it has a shared kind of bike and pedestrian pathway. So it's a combined pathway. It's 15 feet wide, so pretty wide to accommodate people walking and biking. The buffer is increased somewhat. It's now 10 feet, and this accommodates the potential for water quality swales. So we can now, you know, introduce water quality, stormwater management from the site potentially along the shared bike and pedestrian path. So those are the two concepts. So what did we hear from the open house? What are some of the results that we heard from over 200 plus survey respondents? So this is the results of the questions that we asked. And in this graph, this table rather, we combined the responses from when we asked the question, you know, what do we think about the different elements of these concepts? We combined responses that said, yeah, this is okay, and the responses of those that said, this is good, this looks really good. So these percentages show the combination of results from those that said okay and those that said it was good. So similar to the alternatives, we tested this across 5 different kind of elements of that cross-section. How does this address crossing? How does this address pedestrian safety, bike safety, that buffer that's so important, and then overall, how does it address all of these? And so the result, you know, kind of like the alternatives B and C, it's really similar. So, you know, very similar on both concepts for the crossing design. Again, the crossings are essentially the same. Pedestrian safety, bike safety, the highway buffer, all within, you know, a 1 to 3% difference of responses. Overall, there was slightly more interest in that concept B, but again, it's really support for both of those concepts equally. So some more comments, some more feedback we found from that survey. Again, this set of questions had an open-ended response question, so you were able to provide, you know, your comments and describe more about how you felt. And overall, across all those comments, there is general support for some type of street front improvement. You know, comments like, oh, it would just be great to have something, you know, there's nothing there right now, there's not even a curb. It would just be great to see some improvement. So overall improvement for something to take place. But a lot of comments about, well, how would that work? You know, we'd have to figure that out. How could this happen? So a lot of comments about wanting to see more details on some of these. Regarding the crossing, there were a lot of comments about concern that if a at-grade crossing were to take place, if it were installed, a lot of comments saying that, you know, I wouldn't use it. The traffic speeds, there's no way, you know, motorists would stop in time. I just don't see that being something that we'd use. So a little bit of concern around that. But another kind of area of support was for that buffer. So a lot of interest in having some sort of a buffer, especially a vegetated buffer to separate people walking and biking from motor traffic. So like the alternatives, with the land use alternatives, we also talked about this with our project team, with the county, with ODOT, to talk about, you know, what do you think about these different concepts? So a couple we wanted to highlight here. The first one is if there is a crossing at some point, the importance of making sure that that is parallel with Little Brook Lane. So we just have a continuous sort of a crossing that lines up with that street just east of the subject property. And then really the potential for an at-grade crossing. This isn't the first time this has been looked at. A lot of you have been involved in thinking or looking at a crossing of some kind for a while. So we brought this question up again. And the comments here are really about, well, if we want to take a look at an at-grade crossing, we would want to do a traffic study as a next step. Another idea here is, well, if it's 5 lanes now, it's really challenging to get across, even if you're running. What if lanes that taper, that currently taper east of the site, what if those were to taper from 5 lanes to 3 lanes west of Rhododendron? So now the size, the 5 lanes could potentially taper down to 3 lanes, which make that crossing quite a bit different. So just an idea that came up as we discussed this across the team as some things to think about as we move into the recommendations. Okay, so that was a look at the alternatives. Hopefully that wasn't too painstaking, but I think it's important to walk through exactly, you know, where did these come from? How did we develop any of the recommendations we're talking about? So as I mentioned, this is the first time we're presenting the recommendations. So the whole point of this meeting is to wrap up my presentation and hear from you all. So let's take a look at the recommendations. So pretty clearly we saw from the online open house and survey a lot of support for some kind of housing on this site. There wasn't much support for a hotel. The feasibility study that we talked about also showed a lot of support for some type of housing that could take place here, and maybe not as much for a hotel, definitely for some sort of housing. So the preferred alternative, the draft preferred alternative would include similar to those alternatives you saw, except the number of housing units is reduced from those alternatives based on the zoning and county comments that we got. So this would be basically five, my next slide here, five different housing, walk-up housing apartments, kind of like this image is showing here. So again, that internal circulation street connecting the site and providing parking for these walk-up style apartments. So these are all about two-story style apartments that could work here, and these would be spread out with keeping existing tree canopies. That's essentially why we're kind of highlighting and tracing those existing dump firs and all the other vegetation that's there, is to retain that as to the extent we can. So housing being a big part of the recommendations for the site. And the other thing we heard a lot was having some sort of retail. And we knew from the feasibility study that, small scale has a good chance of working here, but it has to be some sort of high quality space to really make it work. So to the north, we have that, redesign, reuse of that gas station, and then adding another small scale retail space like we talked about in those alternatives, with a patio, a place to gather when we're able to gather again, and some space that kind of aligns with this public plaza. We talked about transit being important for those alternatives, the comments that we got, and really to accommodate the improvements needed for a transit stop in the highway would be really challenging for this site. Showing the fact that we have constraints with setbacks, the best alternative could be having Mount Hood Express routed internal to the site and making the stop within the site rather than where it is now, kind of off on the highway. So the stop would be internal for the transit. It would, as we're heading eastbound on Highway 26, turning out into this drive aisle, stopping, unloading, picking up passengers, and then continuing on and accessing Highway 26 once again. So transit being a big part of this, as well as that park and ride lot that would be shared with the parking for these retail uses. So accommodating transit users and folks that potentially are catching a ride up to the mountain. So the public space, as we mentioned, that was a big part of all three alternatives. We heard a lot of support for that to make sure that that's part of the recommendations. And so that's something that we're recommending in here, is to have that public plaza, that green space, kind of a shared amenity for people that live and work here, as well as folks that are, visiting, that are stopping, going over to the post office, going to the grocery store, maybe the retail spaces here as well. So really highlighting that plaza, the connection to the footbridge, and then these other uses that would take place within this site. All right, so that's the recommended alternative for the land uses. The other part of this I should highlight too is the location of a potential mid-block crossing, if that were to take place someday. We talked about, moving that around. What if it were central to the site? What if it's north of the site? So we did show that here. That's in alignment with Littlebrook Lane to connect to Mount Hood Foods based on the comments we received. So that's where the crossing would take place. All right, let's transition over to the street frontage improvements. And with both of these, as soon as I wrap up the presentation, we can always jump back to these and spend more time looking at these. I realize this is the first time a lot of you are seeing this and you're trying to pick up as much as you can. So we'll be sure to jump back to these when we need to. So the preferred frontage concept for Highway 26 is more close to the concept A that has separated sidewalk with a bike lane. And so some of the dimensions change somewhat to accommodate everything based on the parameters that we had with the highway right-of-way. So we still have the wide 8-foot sidewalk separated from the bike lane being an 8-foot wide dedicated bike lane. And then that buffer, that vegetated buffer that we know is so important, that would be part of those frontage improvements as well. So improved conditions for walking and biking, public transit being accommodated internal to the site with a stop that's at the center of the site. And then the crossing, having that potential for a crossing at some point with a pedestrian refuge that's at the center of the highway, and some optional beacons to stop traffic to allow pedestrians to cross the highway safely. So just some precedent examples in other communities that have a similar treatment. Here's an example of the separated sidewalk and bike lane. So showing kind of how that can work. Number of ways to do that, and almost all showing a combination of where options are for street lighting, or pedestrian scale lighting, for street trees, for vegetation, a lot of options for that. And then the vegetated buffer, kind of what that could look like and how that could function. So finally, an example of a crossing with a pedestrian refuge and these Hawk signal beacons to make that crossing take place. So just an example of what that might look like and how that could take place in this context in Rhododendron. Okay, so I know we definitely want to save plenty of time for questions and comments. It looks like we've got plenty of chats to start with. So Alex, I think what we want to do is let's start with some of these chat features, chat comments. And let's get through a few of those. And then what we'll do is we'll make sure we have time for those of you that want to talk more and ask a question while we're here together. So Alex,
John, I've been keeping track, but just before we do that, Stephen had a comment that he wanted to get out there.
Oh, great.
First, and then we can step through some of the comments. And yeah, I've been taking notes on kind of the general topic areas. But yeah, Stephen.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Alex. I just want everybody to understand that the CPO is very concerned with the public portion of this particular survey and not necessarily the private property portion of this whole project. The only reason that the Mount Hood Holdings property and the Always Towing property is involved in this is because the Transportation Growth Management Quick Response Grant required us to have a site-specific area for us to concentrate on in order to get the monies and the grant monies to come up with a cross section for Highway 26, which is basically the public portion of all of this. I know Brett Fisher is attending this meeting, who is with Mount Hood Holdings, and he's watching this very, very closely. He and Kirk Hanna, but it is their property and they can do with it what they want. And this is not going to be dictated by the CPO at all. The CPO is more interested in the public portions of this area, the area specifically coming off the Swinging Bridge and the area by the DAR monument, and the way that ODOT is going to be handling the crossings of Highway 26, and the way that ODOT is going to be handling the pedestrian sidewalks going down, up and down 26. And so with that said, I just wanted that clarity there, that the CPO is more concerned with the public portion of this rather than the private portion of this, if that's understood.
Steve, that's a great point, and thank you for bringing that up. And I think we Scott might have mentioned that at the beginning. That's a really great point to stress. And looks like Sharon, you had a comment here that's similar to Steve's. That's exactly right. This is as I mentioned earlier, this is a very unique project to really, think about the community vision for a private property. Usually we see these types of things for, public property, public parks, but this is very unique in the sense that this is a private development site, but we're also talking about all the public improvements, like you mentioned, Steve, highway frontage, public plaza, public park, crossing, those types of things that we can have a lot greater influence over. So that's a great point. Thanks for clarifying that.
John, some of the other questions, since we're on kind of that public the public transportation side of that, and I think you mentioned this in your presentation as well, but like maybe ODOT or the county to discuss it as well. The crossing and what additional studies would be required. We didn't do a traffic study as a part of this. That would be evaluated at a future date. There was also a question, since we're talking about the right-of-way, is 3 lanes versus 5 lanes and kind of that transition near Rhododendron. That essentially goes from smaller to bigger. And so I'm wondering, Kate or Scott, if you would mind jumping in on that and just providing a little bit of additional information on what the community can expect or kind of how this would move forward.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Hawkins. I'm a planner with the Oregon Department of Transportation. And thank you for this great presentation. Regarding the pedestrian crossing, it's a hot button issue, and I think ODOT is eager to help make this a safer pedestrian environment for all road users. And so the question is how best to do that. And we've been chatting with the county and the MIG folks about different options here and whether the center refuge island is best, and looking at other treatments. It is going to require more research, and I think a traffic study will help us evaluate what kind of treatment is best. And we're just going to have to be evaluating things like maintenance concerns is a topic that comes up frequently, knowing that this area sees a lot of snowfall and that plowing needs to happen on a regular basis. And I think a pedestrian crossing could be more easily approved by our state traffic engineers if once we see things like sidewalks and curbs throughout the entire community, that's likely to naturally slow speeds throughout Rhododendron. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's going to be a continued effort moving forward, but ODOT wants to work with the community here. And then regarding the lane transition, this was actually an idea that came up from ODOT staff. So I think we're excited about the opportunity. As someone pointed out in the chat comments, the transition, you're only moving it a certain number of feet. And so the potential impacts to improving safety and reducing speeds and preventing that jockeying for position that's happening now is exciting. And we have some new urban design guidance that I think can support that. So it doesn't mean it's easy, but I think there's potential, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Great, thank you, Kate. And we will get to more on that topic, and definitely want to hear other questions. I do want to respond to some of the comments in the chat feature. And Alex, thank you for kind of following up on some of these. But going back a little bit here, Heather had a question asking what was the economic impact and potential revenue generation of different housing hotel options to the local businesses. Was that something that we presented for people to consider in the survey? And the answer is we did not have sort of the economic impact with that feasibility study. The feasibility study was essentially looking at what's the likelihood of any one of these types of land uses to take place and thrive in Rhododendron. So that was essentially what that feasibility told us. I think if that could be a recommendation if that's something we want to consider, to look at, potential studies looking at revenue generation for something like a hotel. What would that do to the area? But that was not something that was part of that feasibility study.
John,
yeah,
there was a number of questions about bathrooms, and I think more the plaza in general. That was actually a lot of topic within the chat was, for or against, but also that there is an issue right now, just kind of what people are doing out there naturally. And so, maybe from the plaza standpoint, maybe if you could describe a little bit more in detail, like what a plaza is, and then did you consider any restroom facilities as a part of that?
Yeah, those are some good questions. And I know, looking back at Rhody Rising and some of the meetings that took place with the community, I think I saw one finding. It was like 10 people for a restroom, 10 people against a restroom. And so that's definitely something we were thinking about. But taking a step back, the question I see here is, what is a public plaza? What does that look like? Basically a place, it could be a combination of lawn, it could be, pavers, but an open space that allows people to enjoy rhododendron. And you're getting off of the highway. Maybe it's designed in a way that has some buffering from the noise, from all the activity taking place. But it's essentially a place like a public park that people are enjoying. They feel welcome, and also something that creates a sense of community. So you think about some of the parks and plazas you've been to, where it's really defining and making the place what it is. It's something that makes you remember a place like Rhododendron. This great plaza. We stopped there for lunch, and we're able to kind of walk around. It was something we'll never forget. So that's what we had in mind with the plaza. Regarding the restroom, definitely see a need for something like that, especially if we're considering, now having more commercial uses here, having the transit stop that's going to be taking place there. So that is something that we're considering. But again, looking back at, this isn't the first time this question's come up, and there's kind of ideas for and against that. But I think based on everything we've seen, this would be a really great place for a public restroom, to have something like that happen. I guess the question becomes, and I think I've seen some questions in the chat about, well, who's going to maintain that? Who's going to pay for it? Who takes care of that facility? And that's something that we have to work out. So good comments. And again, that's something that we'll want to keep thinking about, and think about in particular who's going to pay for that and take care of it.
I think the next question is probably for Scott. There was a few questions, Scott, in the chat about bike lanes and kind of where do they go? What do they do? Is it just a short section here, or how does it start to connect to a broader system? So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. It would be initially just for this site. So as part of the development, it would include whatever amenities that are the result of this effort, in terms of bike facility and pedestrian facility. Wherever we land on that would just be for in front of the subject property. But then there would be consideration if there's an agreement for something that might be suitable then for the wider Rhody community, in terms of if future properties develop in Rhododendron, to have a consistent cross-section that applies to other properties. That's something that we can look at. But initially it would just be for in front of the subject property. There isn't funding right now for any further active transportation facilities in Rhododendron. So I appreciate that question though.
A couple other questions that came up. Let's see, just making sure I grab all of these. So I think there's there's a question, this is probably to ODOT and the county, kind of like the chicken and the egg. If ODOT doesn't do the traffic study, how will we know if we can get, you know, the pedestrian refuge? How does that work? And I think the first piece of that is, you know, having that study listed in a plan as a priority is the first piece. And then I think then that allows the county and the CPO to, you know, to use that we have this within a plan to be able to work with ODOT to be able to do that. Kate or Scott, any additional comment on that, or does that sum it up?
Yeah, I think it does from the county standpoint, and Kate can certainly add to your comment and my comment, which is I think having it in a plan is a very important first step. Because you know, an analysis looking at a pedestrian crossing and a potential you know, reduction in the lanes, that would be a pretty large engineering effort to look at that and do that analysis. So I think, you know, getting into a plan would be a great first step. And I don't know if Kate, you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree. Having it in a plan is certainly going to help in just in moving this conversation forward. And yeah, no further comments.
Okay. Let's see, John, there's a comment about transit, and I think Garrett had a question specifically about why looping the transit line kind of off of 26 and then bringing it back out. I know we had talked about that a fair bit. I'm wondering if either John or Scott, you could speak to that.
Yeah, I can. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Well, I can speak, maybe Kate as well, if you want to chime in. But so we have looked at options, both kind of a little pullout onto the highway that didn't go into the site itself. The problem with that, considering the constraints that John talked about on the site with the Zigzag River, the improvements that we're talking about, the public improvements with the bike and ped facility, and also a setback, a property line setback to the buildings. And it's a pretty narrow site in itself. So to add a turnout for a Mount Hood Express bus would really constrain that site and really narrow it to a pretty narrow, constrained, developable envelope. And then there was some safety concerns of having a bus stop on a busy state highway. So for those reasons, that's the reason that the transit stop is proposed on this preferred alternative in the development site.
Right.
Did you want to add anything to that, John? Or?
No, I think that was a good summary. Yeah, I think it goes back to the sense that, you know, really the river setback, you know, 100 feet from the river, the 25 feet from the highway, it really is a matter of if we add another, you know, 25, 30 feet of width for that transit lane, it really starts to limit pretty much anything you can do with that site to make anything work. So that seemed like a good option, you know, to have that routed. Also, in terms of you know, getting people off the highway, in another sense. So that's another consideration that we had for that different option. I did get a couple of emails before the meeting, and a couple of folks had asked about the welcome signage that I know the CPO has been working on, and that's been a long time coming. And the question was, you know, how come, you know, are we addressing that? Is that part of the vision? And I think the best answer is we don't have that shown in this graphic, but I think that's a good idea to add that. Again, you know, really thinking about what's in front of this site versus the larger rhododendron community that extends beyond this site. There's that point, but I think it's a good idea, just following up with those emails, we could include, you know, the fact that we want to see some welcome signage. That's something that's been of interest through a separate planning process. So I just thought that was important to point out. Okay. So there's a question on timing of improvements, and I want to save that one for last. I think it's a great question. I do want to get to kind of next steps. But before we get to timing and kind of what happens next, where do we go from here? I think we have about 15 minutes, so I think it would be great to hear from those of you, and keep adding to the chats. Feel free to do that. So is there any other questions that someone wanted to ask, outside of the chat that requires a little bit more discussion? This would be a great time to do that.
Yeah, and if you do have a question, since we have 33 people, not including staff, just go and use the hand feature, raise your hand feature, or raise your hand. We do that sometimes too. Because I can't see everybody on my screen, the raise your hand feature puts you right up to the top, so we can make sure we can answer your question.
I will say we are kind of going through these chats pretty quickly, and one thing we want to let you know is we're going to provide responses to all of these. So we're going to collect the chat, we're going to save the chat, and we'll have responses to all of these. So if you feel like we didn't get to your chat, or get a thorough response, we'll make sure we do
that. For whatever reason, I think my hand feature isn't raising, but I am raising. I'm not sure if that's showing on the screen. Susie Kirshner.
We see you, Susie.
Okay, now you hear me. Like it or not.
I hear you.
For better or worse. And I appreciate what you're doing and the time and thought that you have put into, and also the community has. I wanted to reinforce the idea that for me, a core element or feature is the traffic study and how it fits within the larger context of the corridor. And because I think many of the dreams and fantasies that we have for our community are really going to be predicated on what we can do to create the safety and the livability and therefore generate the revenue that we might look for if we in fact diminish the speeds. And so it is, as the postmistress says, it's terrifying to look out and see what's happening on the highway. And the speeds that are in excess of 60 miles an hour. And the fact, because I'm part of an old crew that really fought the expansion of the highway and used a lot of national studies to show what happens to communities when we do that in terms of lost business and revenue. And so there are a lot of communities in the country that are doing, considering what they're called road diets, and they actually are downsizing. So I'm really delighted to see your suggestion of diminishing the number of lanes, but I think that it bears or would merit really thoughtful consideration in terms of what is that corridor between all the way from Zigzag into Rhododendron, because what happens with not just cars but with the trucks are this, the speeding up in between and then having to slow down, and that's where we say the dogs that are hit, the cats that are hit, the bears that are hit, and so there's an overall traffic study that I think merits some real thoughtful consideration in terms of what ODOT and the state police are doing, to mitigate some of those issues. And then if those are mitigated, then this whole design is going to be able to flourish and be informed by those things. So that's that rant. The other thing is, I really appreciate the public plaza concept, or the idea of a gathering space. And I would just want to put a plug in and encourage it to be reflective of the natural environment, and maybe not be considering things such as grass and and this is probably down the road in design, but letting the natural environment really inform the design of that public gathering space.
Great. Thank you, Susie. Brett, you had your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to comment here as a representative of the property owner here. This is very much in line with what we envisioned at this property when we actually purchased it. I guess my one concern here is mainly about the park and ride situation. You know, we were a little reluctant at the beginning of this to allow the transit stop there because of how it could affect people's opinion moving forward when we did develop this property in a plan similar to that you have laid out here. And I think the space that we have to develop here and the space that we're talking about due to the setbacks and all the constraints that we have, I think all the space is going to be at a premium, and including a park and ride space in with the residential there is going to be very difficult from a use standpoint, from an access standpoint. So I just wanted to express that, but I just wanted to communicate to everybody listening, just as one of the property owners, that we're very supportive of this process. And again, this is a lot in line of what we envisioned with this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, Brett. We appreciate that. All right. So other questions that are out there, and like I said, we can keep them coming. Otherwise, we can talk a little bit more about the question about, you know, what happens from here. What are the next steps?
Question?
John.
Yes, John.
Why can't the transit be a bus pullout at the swinging bridge area, and with just a little bit of work, you could put it so a bus could pull off of the highway into an exchange area and then back onto the highway. Then you wouldn't be interrupting private property and would give more use to the public area at the swinging bridge.
John, that's a great point. I think the one thing, and that was definitely one of our first things we looked at, was if, you know, we're going to accommodate transit in a way that's better than it is accommodated now, you know, how would that take shape? And I think it goes back to just the incredible amount of right-of-way that would need to take place, again, eating into the developable portion of the property. Because I think the main thing to consider is the kind of nature of transit vehicles, buses, slowing down to get off the highway and then accelerating to get back on the highway. And the amount of the length that takes is greater than just that one plaza area. So we thought the same thing until it came down to, you know, just how much length that would need to take place, that would have to be off of the highway to allow the bus, you know, to slow down safely and to accelerate safely.
Well, at that point, they should be doing 40 miles an hour rather than 60.
Mhm.
And through lighting,
Good luck.
traffic light, so you have on the uphill side, you have a warning that there's a bus about to turn on. You might be able to control your traffic a little better that way.
Great. Thank you, John. Other comments or questions? We have just a few more minutes. Want to see if there's anybody else who raise your hand or use the chat feature, or if there's any other questions out there.
Okay.
Brett had his hand up.
Yeah, Brett.
Yeah, I just wanted to one comment on what John was just asking, and where my concern is with that is actually more, you know, obviously we create a need, possibly more of a need for a transit stop here with housing, but it just has a lot to do from my standpoint with the parking and the limited amount of space that would be available for that parking. And, you know, maybe that can move down into Welch's, and maybe long-term plan, the bike path continues down to that park and ride station, wherever that may be, or something of that nature. But I just think we would struggle to accommodate the summer, mainly the summer parking needs there with the bikers. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Brett.
It sounds like Stephen, you said Robert had a question. I'm sorry, thank you for letting me know. I didn't see his hand up. Robert, did you have a question? Oh, sorry, I see it now. Thank you. Floor is yours. Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
Is there a plan of the rest of the community of upgrades like landscape in the rest of the community, and working with businesses to get a common look like they have in government camp to upgrade the appearance of the entire community, not just the new development?
Thanks, Robert. That's a great question. Scott, do you want to maybe start with a response to that one, just for sort of the community-wide plan for Rhododendron?
Yeah, so appreciate that question. There isn't, after this project, there isn't plans to do a wider roadie plan. We could certainly have conversation with the community and see if there's other funding opportunities to do something for, you know, the wider community. I know the kind of the ideas and the concepts that you're talking about were looked at in the roadie rising visioning plan, and there's some great ideas and concepts out of that effort. But at this point, there's not, we don't have the staff capacity or the funding to do something for the, you know, beyond this effort right now. But I'm more than happy to take a look and see if there's funding opportunities or an appetite to do something, you know, beyond just this subject property.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Great.
just a couple of chats that came in, and they're both back to transit and, you know, why Rhodey and why not maybe somewhere else like Welch's, for example. And I think that's a great question, and that's something that we can talk more about, you know, on the project team, is to think more about, you know, not the fact that there won't be a transit stop in Rhodey, but more about if we're having more infrastructure like park and ride, and we're going to be accommodating more people, is there maybe a better location for that? So I think those are some good questions to raise.
Although Anita also commented that those folks do support local businesses, and so, you know, there's that balancing act about, you know, what attracts that area, that bus for those, you know, transit riders or cyclists that are using it to get up the hill. But definitely something we can look at.
Thanks, Alex. One more comment, and I want to kind of talk about this slide you're seeing. Let's see. David asked about the dimensions for the frontage improvement. So 6-foot buffer seems pretty narrow. 15-foot bike path seems pretty excessive, considering minimal bike traffic. And David, probably the best response to that one is the guidance that we use for those dimensions come from the Blueprint for Urban Design, the manual for designing streets and highway projects from ODOT. So we did kind of go from the source on that one, and I just wanted to point that out as a resource. And it's not to say, and I think Kate, you might be able to speak to this, it's not to say that, you know, those dimensions are, you know, totally set in stone, but as far as a starting point for, you know, what width is what, that's where those came from.
Yeah, the Blueprint for Urban Design the intent is that you're creating an urban design that is appropriate for the context. And so it's looking at more than just the speeds and number of lanes on the highway, but also the types of land uses and all the things in the environment and how that should inform the design.
Great.
Which I think is a good point in terms of looking at that proportionality and design that's a bit different, since we are a bit different. we can apply some of the principles of urban design, but it's a bit different too. Or it has some possibilities.
Thanks, Susie and Kate. Okay, so for next steps, so first kind of point of order is next steps in this project. You know, what do we do from here? And the next is, what do we do with all these great ideas and comments that we've received? So maybe we'll address the second part first and the first part second. So thinking about the kind of what's the timing? You know, how long is this going to take? I think, Scott, not to put you in the hot seat, or even Stacy, but I think it's a good question about, you know, these are recommendations, but I think the next step is really about prioritizing it at a county level, at a state level, and then finding the funding to make some of those improvements happen, as well as the property redevelopment, and when some of those frontage improvements take place to coincide with, you know, whatever happens to this site, having those improvements take place when that development occurs. So the quick response is, you know, pending development of these sites, when that takes place, and pending the funding to actually make some of that happen. But Scott, you maybe have some more light to shed on that.
Yeah, well, so what we'll do is we'll take this great feedback and the comments that you're providing tonight and do some updates to the draft concept plan. And then I think there is an opportunity to look at if there is perhaps a cross-section that we want to look at adopting into county local road standards or into our comprehensive plan. We could take a look at that and see if that is something that is a result of this effort. You know, as we talked about, the private property in that site itself is not something that the county would adopt into any of our regulatory documents. But to kind of guide this through to kind of a community effort that is, you know, consensus around what we're looking at here is our hope. And we do have, you know, another step built into this process to get kind of a final look at the refined plan and get your final comments on this. And that's something we're in the process of pulling together and figuring out how we're going to present that, whether it's in the form of another virtual meeting, or perhaps since some community members don't have internet access, in terms of equity and making sure everybody has a chance to comment, perhaps doing some sort of project displays somewhere in the community where people can go view and provide input in a different manner than, you know, this weird kind of Zoom world we're living in. So more on that later. Soon we'll be in touch regarding that. And if there's things that you think of regarding what you've heard tonight and what we've discussed, please feel free to email me, call me, reach out to me to provide more input, ideas. Those are certainly welcome. So that is kind of hopefully a summation of where we're going to go from here.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Scott. And as far as everything you saw tonight, and you know, the fact that we are talking about the fact that this is a draft set of recommendations, we do want to keep this open, and we know not everybody in this meeting right now represents everybody in the entire community. So as Scott mentioned, we're going to post this video and even this presentation to the project website, and that's here at this rather long URL, but basically go to Clackamas County website and you'll find the Rhody Main Street project homepage, and we've got all the materials we've completed to date. And like I said, we'll post this presentation so you can take some more time to look through these, because I know this was a lot to go through for the first time to see everything. So So that's the first thing. We'll also have a comment form on the website. So if you have more to say, if you want to get your neighbor to chime in, there's a great way to do that. Again, this is a community project, so we want to hear from everyone. So just be sure to check out the website. We'll keep things updated. And then as Scott mentioned, we know that a lot of folks don't want to use Zoom, don't want to go online, don't have internet. So we want to make sure we'll provide some materials out in the community in a way that's safe and within safe guidelines for doing something like that. So we'll provide more information on that.
John, just before I sign off, I just put the website in the chat, so you can, if you want to click straight out of the chat, that'll take you to the website. There was a question from Heather, just directed to me. I think this would be a question actually for Stephen or Scott. Is there a Rhododendron Business Association or group that can come together to have a vision plan for the economics along with the CPO? So, that's a different animal than the design side that we were looking at. So, Heather, Stephen, Heather. It sounds like that would be the connection right there. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The Mount Hood Area Chamber of Commerce is working with us, although because of COVID, just like the CPO, there have been no Mount Hood Area Chamber of Commerce meetings. But the Chamber of Commerce we work with, and if we want to, for just rhododendron, we could get a rhododendron group together of just people in rhododendron, the businesses in rhododendron, and have our own kind of mini Chamber of Commerce, if you will. And that's something that the CPO would love to entertain and help facilitate. So maybe we could take a look at that as we progress forward. I also want to tell everybody that's here that we have not had a CPO meeting since January of last year because of the COVID crisis. And we elected as a board not to have a CPO meeting because we did not want to be exclusionary and keep people that do not have an internet access from being able to come to a CPO meeting. And so we have elected not to have any CPO meetings. But I see us coming on the downhill side of this COVID thing, and I am confident that by this summer, we will be able to have a face-to-face meeting at, even while maintaining maybe some social distancing, at one of the sites in Rhododendron. And we're also really looking forward to hopefully hosting the Rhododendron Centennial +1 celebration in August of this year. So those things are in the plans and hopefully coming along. So I thank everybody for participating.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Well, thank you, everyone. We're just at time, and I want to be respectful of that. So again, the website, Alex provided the link in the chat. Make sure you click on that. We'll update that with this presentation and keep updated on everything that happens next. So be sure to go to that website, take a look at the presentation, and provide any more comments that you have or any others that you want to loop into this process. So I just wanted to thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. This has been a great meeting, so we really appreciate it. Thank you to ODOT for being here tonight as well. Thank you, Kate. Steve and the CPO, DLCD, and Clackamas County. We really appreciate it. And the Brett Fisher, thank you as well, representing the property owner. This is super helpful to have you here tonight. So thank you, everyone. Be sure to check out the website and stay healthy out there.